Mr. President.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, something I've been hearing a lot lately from members of the media, from many of my Democrat colleagues here in the Senate, and even from the President of the United States, is that democracy is at stake. That democracy will die if we don't make drastic changes to our election system. That we are just one election away from the end of the experiment our founders began in 1776. If my colleagues really believe that our democracy is teetering on the edge of a cliff, that it's going to fall over the edge unless we transform the way we run elections across the entire country, then they need to be able to tell the American people why. But instead, all I'm hearing from Democrats, even from the President himself, is that democracy is on its deathbed, that Americans are no better than George Wallace or Jefferson Davis if they dare to question that, and that the only solution is for one party to rewrite the rules of the United States Senate to pass a completely partisan federal takeover of state and local elections. Those are truly some wild claims. If you take these assertions at face value, I can see why some Americans might be concerned about the state of voting rights in this country. But not a word of what they're saying is true. The good news, Mr. President, is that most people live in the real world, where America shattered records for voter turnout in the 2020 election. 66% of eligible voters cast a ballot, the highest level in 120 years. That translates to 156 million Americans, the most in history. In my state of Nebraska, 76% of voters cast a ballot in the last election. We've been proud to be a no-excuse state for absentee voting for years, since long before the pandemic. We have that law because we want to make it easier for Nebraskans to vote. And there are many other states that don't require voters to provide a reason before voting by mail, not just Nebraska. Across the country, turnout was up in the last election, regardless of race, class, or any other demographic. And according to Pew Research, 94% of 2020 voters, they said voting was easy. Yet Democrats still say that voter suppression is rampant in the United States. The logical response to that is to ask, okay, where? In Georgia, Democrats say. After Georgia passed a new law last year, things have apparently gotten so bad that the president picked Atlanta to give a recent speech on the issue. But if you listened to President Biden's speech, you might have noticed that he barely talked about the Georgia law at all. And when he did, he twisted the law into an unrecognizable caricature, into Jim Crow in the 21st century. He has shamelessly and intentionally misrepresented the Georgia law for months, and his speech last week was no different. But something he didn't say in his speech is that the Georgia law extends early voting to 2.5 weeks. That's longer than blue states like California and New York, and it's longer than the president's home state of Delaware, which currently allows for 0 early voting days. Maybe he should have given that speech at his house in Delaware instead of in Georgia. And he didn't say The language in the Georgia bill that requires voter ID for absentee ballots is very similar to a bill that passed the Senate almost unanimously in 2002, the Help America Vote Act, with President Biden voting in favor. So if the Georgia law is the best Democrats can do, then there is simply no evidence for the idea that Republican state legislatures around the country are trying to restrict voting rights. With that in mind, here's a friendly suggestion for the president. If he truly believes, in spite of all that democracy itself is at stake in a way it has never been before, the last thing he should want is for the voting laws of all 50 states to be overseen by the Department of Justice and a partisan attorney general. That power should remain with state-level secretaries of state, state legislatures, nonpartisan local officials, anyone but one official at one department in one branch of the federal government. In other words, he should want exactly the election system we have now. Our decentralized system, with buy-in from a diverse group of voices, is what allowed states to adapt to the pandemic and achieve voter turnout, a record turnout in 2020. But the Democrats' federal election takeover would give the U.S. Attorney General the power to oversee every state's electoral process, and it would turn the federal government into a piggy bank for House candidates. Everyone running for election in the House of Representatives would have access to federal money through a new program designed to help them fund their campaigns. The federal government would match contributions 6-to-1, meaning money that belongs to taxpayers would go to politicians with views that many of those taxpayers may oppose. This partisan takeover would require states to allow felons to vote once they're out of prison, overruling the states that already have laws in place preventing this. And if Democrats have their way, they will mandate that every single state offers same-day registration at every polling place in the nation. If you live in a state that has decided that that's not a good idea, well, too bad. Mr. President, it's clear that the majority leader wants to get rid of the filibuster to accomplish all of this. But what Democrats are trying to do in Congress right now is the best argument I could ever imagine for keeping the filibuster. Think about it this way. Let's say we're talking before the 2020 election, and I told you that Republicans would retain the presidency and the Senate, and we would win back the House, but the Senate would be split 50-50, and we would barely have a majority in the House. In fact, Republicans are going to have the slimmest majorities in Congress in more than a century. But guess what? Republicans are going to try to pass bills that most Americans don't fully support anyway. And we're going to dismantle a rule that has promoted bipartisanship and compromise in this body for nearly 200 years to accomplish it. And be honest, Mr. President, you would say that's outrageous. And you would be right. It is outrageous. You would be begging those of us on the other side of the aisle to leave the filibuster untouched. And if you think way, way back into the past, all the way back to 2017 and 2018, Republicans were in the same situation that Democrats are in now. We had a Republican president and majorities in both chambers of commerce. We had bigger majorities than the Democrats have today. The former president even outright asked us to abolish the filibuster. And that brought many, many Democrats to the floor praising the filibuster, saying it should never be abolished. But we didn't abolish it, for the simple reason that burning down 200 years of bipartisan history for a few temporary victories is short-sighted at best and institutional arson at worst. And don't think that by presenting this talking filibuster, Americans won't see the Democrats' efforts for what they really are: a ploy to abolish the 60-vote threshold for legislation, to abolish the need for bipartisanship. Because, in reality, it will only take a majority vote to pass controversial bills. Nebraskans can certainly see through this. In Nebraska, state senators have to speak on the floor to filibuster a bill before our legislature. But to overcome a filibuster in Nebraska, you need 2/3 of senators to vote to end debate, not the simple majority that Leader Schumer has proposed before this body today. Nebraskans have benefited from the consensus building and the moderation in developing good legislation this rule promotes for nearly 100 years. We know that it works. The 60-vote threshold in the United States Senate does exactly the same thing for all Americans. So I urge my Democratic colleagues, don't abolish the filibuster. And if Democrats won't listen to reason from Republicans, they should listen to the president himself. When he was a senator, he said, quote, "At its core, the filibuster is not about stopping a nominee or a bill. It's about compromise and moderation," end quote. He's forgotten that now. But that doesn't mean his colleagues who are still here have to forget it. Mr. President, Senate Democrats were happy to use the legislative filibuster hundreds of times under President Trump. Not so long ago, it was, quote, "the most important distinction between the House and the Senate. And without it, the Senate would become much more subject to the winds of short-term electoral change," end quote. That was the now majority leader, and he was 100% correct. But now the Democrats are in power. They have changed their minds. Today, the filibuster is not only no longer essential, but anyone who supports keeping it is called a racist. That is truly incredible, and it is offensive. The Democrats who supported the filibuster a few years ago clearly weren't being truthful, and they aren't being truthful now about the state of voting rights in this country. The problem they're responding to simply doesn't exist, and the solution they have for this imaginary problem would do lasting harm to our democracy. I will be voting against this partisan takeover of our elections. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.